Hello, my name is Richard, and today I'm going to be talking about Just Girls, Hidden Literacies and Life in Junior High by Margaret J. Finders. This review is intended to be brief and will be largely off the cuff for the purposes of saving time and leaving you, the listener, something to discover for yourself. So let's begin. From 1992 to 1993, Margaret Finders, a then veteran language arts instructor of 13 years, stepped outside her normal role and engaged in a year-long ethnographic study of the literacy lives of two groups of 7th grade girls. She did so in order to, quote, better understand the rules and rituals that accompany entry into early adolescence, end quote. Specifically, Finders looked at literacy practices among adolescent females that conflict with literacy expectations of the school institution, or what she refers to as literate underlife. Finders selected her school district of study on the following criteria. 1. The pedagogy was sound. 2. Students were actively engaged in reading and writing. And 3. Students were the center of the curriculum. Finders' research centers on two groups of 7th grade girls from different socioeconomic backgrounds. The social queens, as Finders labels them, are given the names Lauren, Angie, and Tiffany, and reported to come from middle and professional class families, while the designated tough cookies, named Cleo and Dottie, come from working class families living in trailer parks. According to Finders, the social queens, Angie, Lauren, and Tiffany, use literacy as a means of forming close relationships and also excluding those who did not meet the stern measurements and requirements set by the girls themselves. Things like physical appearance, dress, social behavior, academic achievement, and reading and writing preference. These standards were self-policed and moderated by the girls themselves through what Finders refers to as literate underlife. Correlated to this is the observation that the social queens privileged group identity over individual identity. School for the social queens was seen primarily for the social value it allowed in demonstrating allegiances within the peer group. As Finders states, for these adolescents, school was most often perceived as a social arena, a time to connect with friends and make arrangements for after-school activities, and due to their overlapping nature, allowed for a smooth flow between school and home context. Finders interprets the literacy and group practices of the social queens as a means of forming a united front against the accepted literacy practices of the school institution. However, at the same time, these tools are also used for exclusion and a means of measuring members of the peer group against one another for status and power. This notion forms a nice segue into a review of the literacy practices of the social queens, the first of which being reviewed will be teen magazines. Teen magazines are observed as serving as templates for the girls as they navigate their way into identity shaping and becoming an adult. Finders observes that for the girls, teen magazines defined womanhood and set the markers of status and how closely one can match the images and advertisements on every page. As Finders states, guided by images of beauty and sexuality transported through print and other media, the queens attempted to fit themselves into a singular standard of feminine adolescence as a measure of their own growth into adulthood. The social queens, for the most part, view themselves as trying to stake out their adulthood, and in opposition to that are the teachers and school institution and those literacy practices associated with that stand in their way. It's for this reason that the social queens view their rebellious behavior as claiming their adulthood. They're becoming adult by acting out, essentially behaving contrary to children, whereas children would follow the rules, adults would not, at least in the mind of the social queen. Unlike the teen magazines, which were primarily read outside of school, literacy events like note passing and bathroom graffiti writing took place behind the scenes, away from the view of teachers, and in the case of the notes, away from other peer groups as well. The bathroom graffiti had a particular usage of expressing sexualized text and images and staking claims on boys. Group identity and a lack of individual voice among the social queens becomes apparent through Finder's interviews with the individual girls. Finders reports that, alone, each girl appeared quieter, much less confident, and generally answered any number of questions with, "I don't know." In contrast to this, when in the presence of peers, the girls would have greater voice and greater weight to their opinions. Not listed as an official literate underlife practice in her book, Finders does take note of gossip. Gossip among the social queens was prevalent, so much so that girls are reported to have avoided being absent from a group for fear of being the target of ridicule or speculation by that pack. Finders characterizes this behavior as a way in which adolescents establish and clarify norms, a means of constantly checking and testing one another against the rules. This is in contrast to the unified front and coordinated performances that the social queens put on for the public. Away from the public performance or backstage, the girls can drop their guard and, according to Finders, engage in competition with one another, often centering on physical attractiveness and value to the opposite sex. Thus, competition formed the basis for the group relationship. This culture of competition played out in the group's literacy practices as well. In contrast to the social queens, the tough cookies show a favoring of individuality over group membership and deny the influence of others in their work, even when it is obviously apparent. And whereas the social queens saw school as primarily serving a social function, Dottie and Cleo, the tough cookies, viewed academics and the adoption of sanctioned literacy practices as a means of achieving success. In her report, Finders found that these two characteristics came at odds, and as the tough cookies both often exercised their individuality, they also did it at the expense of the institution's group-based literacy practices. By doing such things as forging peer reviews and correction events, the tough cookies had co-opted the sanctioned literacy practices of the school. In this way, we see a commonality between the tough cookies and the social queens. Both groups of girls, although from different socioeconomic backgrounds, seek to resist and co-opt the sanctioned literacy practices by creating a literate underlife. Both groups seek to find their voice and identity in cultures and worlds beyond the classroom, albeit in different ways, and with different results. As Finders illustrates in her work, the literate underlives of both groups of girls are shaped by context and factors outside the limits of the school and not afforded a space for expression and validation therein. The social queens, for example, came from wealthier and more affluent households, which afforded them time and money to chase luxuries, to participate in extracurricular activities, and to engage in other literacy events such as the school yearbook. These outside-of-school privileges awarded the social queens particular status and power within the social hierarchy of school. Compare this to the households of the tough cookies, who came from working-class families dedicated to upward-class advancement. In these households, literacy practices were family-based and were guided by a greater sense of urgency and cause for insulation. In another way of putting it, you could say that to the tough cookies and their families, extracurricular activities were family-based, not school-based. This basic comparison forms the basis for Finders' argument, which is that the pedagogical practices of the school district that she studied at the time, practices that were deemed up-to-date and with a proven track record for success, were not addressing the multiple contexts in which an adolescent forms identity, in particular, a female adolescent. There are essentially intersections of identity at play, from gender and sexual maturation to a sense of self and one's relationship to other people. Well, that pretty much wraps up my brief review of Just Girls, Hidden Literacies in Life in Junior High by Margaret J. Finders. I hope that you've been able to gain some kind of knowledge of Margaret J. Finders' ethnographic report and the basic theoretical framework for her work. However, I will admit that I didn't do her any justice in regard to the theoretical framework, as I frankly overlooked it for the sake of focusing mostly on her subjects. My general focus was on the subject, since it seems to better suit me to understand the subject before I decide to move ahead with some kind of methodology. So I hope I at least inspired you to look deeper into this subject as well, there's a lot more to gain from Margaret J. Finder's work, and I hope this is just the tip of the iceberg and has allowed you to kind of learn something and gain a desire for more. So until next time, take care.